it seems we are complete and just in time. There were always discussions that were starting at 5 or 15:15. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first edition of Druckfrisch, fresh from the press in this year. I'm actually a dinosaur to this format because we invented it 11 years ago with some colleagues. Oh my gosh. So, and we invented this as a format, as a meeting place to celebrate the achievements, the fruits of hard academic work, which usually is consisting of lonely hours in archives and in studies and in fieldwork. But at the end of this process, very often we have wonderful books which are published, which either disappear in libraries and in shelves, or which are read and widely discussed in seminars and in different forms and formats. And one of those wonderful books that will inspire discussion and that will pave the way for new ways of thinking, not only about Africa, but also thinking about mobilities and activisms, thinking about global history, I think is Ismay's book. And it's a very big pleasure for us to have you here and to have you launch the book with us. I will briefly introduce you, Ismay, and also our commentators, before we then have the chance to get an insight into this book, which is really fresh from the press. So CUP was really slow in delivering it, but they finally dared to send it to Leipzig. So Ismay completed her PhD at the European University Institute in Florence, which is a great place to do a PhD, among other places you can do, but it's an inspiring environment, obviously. Afterwards, after a PhD in 2019, she joined a very inspiring project at Edinburgh University, a Lava Home Trust funded project, which was called Another World, East Africa in the Global 1960s, which has produced and brought together great scholars and produced a lot of research. But one of the resources this project produced, which I want to draw your attention to, is actually a teaching resource. It's a website of global biographies of East African activists, biographies, archival research that is provided there. It's a great resource, not only for students, but also for researchers. Ismay also had a number of fellowships to finish her book or to start new research, among other at Tampere University in Finland, but also in Munich at the Global History Center there. And then she joined Leipzig, the ReCentGlobe, where she's now working on a new project to look into environmental histories and to think about connections between technology, environment, and ideas of the information society in Africa in the second half of the 20th century, and thus also contributing to our growing interest of environmental histories. She has not only published this book, but also in a number of journals, in historical research, in the Journal of African History. But one of the, for me, also inspiring publications, not in a journal, but in a collective monograph, which is on dealing with how to research biographies in transnational and transregional contexts. And that book has just come out. It's called Global Biographies, Lived History as a Method. So for everybody who's interested in doing biographical research, that's a must read, I would say. As not yet readers of the book, as I said, it has just come out of the printing press, 3 commentators whose research expertise perfectly relates to Ismay's and the book's focus, both in regional terms by looking at Africa, not only Eastern Africa, but also other parts of Africa, but also by being interested in transnational, transregional connections and activisms, and interested in situating Africa in global contexts. First, I would like to introduce Ana Moledo. Many of you might know her as a researcher here at ReCentGlobe as well. She's just about to finish her book on Lusophone activists and their transnational, transregional networks in the 20th century. She joined us here at ReCentGlobe after her MA in Global Studies, so that's always a good starting point for such a research, and then won the Pre-Doc Award of Leipzig University before she joined us here and works on her PhD. John, I actually wanted to introduce you coming from Goethe University from Frankfurt am Main, but I realized you live in Leipzig, which is, of course, a natural connection because John has done his PhD here at Leipzig University before he left to other enterprises. and he works at Frankfurt am Main, Goethe University, at the Center for Interdisciplinary African Studies, the Institute for England and American Studies, and the Frankfurt Memory Studies platform. So he is working on trans-regional connections between Asia and Africa, specifically on political and economic interactions in this regard. He's now focusing very much on the Indian Ocean and also specializes on global memory politics, on transnational migration, on cosmopolitanism and conflict. So a wonderful array of expertise that he can bring in here. He has also held a number of research fellowships at Chinese and American universities. So in this regard, he's not only researching transnationality, but also living it, which of course does inform research a lot. And last but not least, Mariusz Łukaszewski is sitting here. He joins us from far away from the Beethovenstraße, from the Institute of African Studies. He's a senior researcher there. He holds a PhD in international economic history from Geneva, from the Graduate Institute of International Development in Geneva in Switzerland. As an historian of Southern Africa, he's very much interested in economic and business history and in the role of economic institutions and economic organizations and intermediaries. And as all of us here, very much interested in situating African histories in broader transnational, continental, and global contexts. My name is Steffi Marung, and I'm moderating this session. Before I give the floor to the commentators, I actually wanted to ask you, Ismay, if you could also enlighten a little bit the audience, how you started thinking about this project, how you conceived of this idea, and how this idea also transformed in the process of working on it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steffi. Thank you, all of you, for being here, and especially Mariusz and John and Anna for agreeing to comment on the book and to have read parts of the book already. And it's really a pleasure to be able to launch it here at ReCentGlobe, because although I finished the book before taking on my post here, it's kind of been formative to the putting together the final stages, and also the research that's going on here is really very relevant to a lot of the book's themes. So thank you to ReCentGlobe and the director Matthias Medell as well. And especially to Roman, who could not be here, for helping organize, and to the rest of the technical team as well. I'm really grateful, and it's wonderful to be here. Yeah, so the book started, perhaps the seed of the book was a topic that I started working on during my MA thesis, which was a small organization called the Committee of African Organizations, founded in London in 1958, I think by a Ugandan activist, Abu Mayanja, who appears in the book. And I had been inspired to do some research into this organization. I was based in Bristol, and Rob Skinner, who I was working with, had done research on anti-apartheid activism. So after having tried to find out more about this organization, I found that it didn't fit so neatly into lots of the really excellent literature that was coming out around that time about sort of new histories of the period of decolonization, which were less interested than previous historians had been in this kind of the contestation of nationalism and the nation state, but more interested in these different solidarity projects and intellectual connections as well that emerged between decolonizing countries in the post-war period. So when I took this project to the EUI as a PhD to try and kind of try and make sense of this very small and kind of not so coherent group of activists, I was encouraged at the EUI to kind of, as the PhD students are there, to think of it in terms of these bigger questions of the globality of, in this case, anti-colonialism. And this helped me to see that this London organization was by no means the center of the kind of broad constellation that I was trying to understand, but instead was in a way, its edge was quite marginal to the bigger picture. And so I was trying to then piece together some of the most prominent activists. I was interested initially in their political thought, in their political organizations. But over the course of sort of researching this network, the focus shifted quite a bit, as becomes apparent in the book, that I ended up being more interested really in the day-to-day doing and practices of transnational activism. And in that sense, this became more of a book about transnational activism than about the political thought of decolonization in East Africa. Perhaps I won't say more than that now about the various arguments that come out of the book and the regional focus, but I might just share, for the benefit of people who are new to the topic, perhaps just share the table of contents and maps from the book. So this is the region shaded in grey is what I ended up, the region that ended up being most important in my thinking, or in the thinking of the activists that I look at, I argue. And on the right, this more global-looking map just charts some of the trajectories the stories that emerge in the book, and perhaps just to give a sense of the chapters as well. But maybe that's enough to give people an impression of how I came to it. Thank you.
No, I think it's a wonderful bridge to the comments. So you can always have this table of content in mind when the commentators navigate us through the book. Shall we start with Anna?
Thanks a lot for inviting me, and it has been a pleasure reading it, and it has been also an inspiring read to reflect on my own project, so thanks a lot. I will try to summarize. I had, as I said, various impressions, and it's a long list, but we can talk about that later on. I will try to focus on the central aspects. Ismay's book is part of the global and international history series of the Cambridge University Press that has published seminal works on anti-colonial internationalisms and African nationalisms and other important isms of the 20th centuries, such as Anti-Imperial Metropolis by Michel Goebel or Comrades Against Imperialism by Michel Leroux. African activists in a decolonizing world not only qualifies and puts into a new perspective some of the assumptions and arguments that Goebel and Leroux made some years ago, but also confirms, if this is still necessary, that a scholarship on decolonization and anti-colonialism has really flourished under the roof of global history. You're a great storyteller and don't hide your talent for spinning together this almost as a novel, without compromising the academic rigor, critical analysis of sources, and attention to the detail. And that's quite an achievement, considering the dry style of some academic works. This is not a history of successful anti-colonial activism, quite the contrary. Ismay takes the reader on a journey to consider how failures and frustrations, forgotten and unpublished pamphlets, dismissed resolutions, conferences that didn't happen, become stepstones of larger and symbolic events of anti-colonial activism that we all know, like Bandung or the All Africans People Conference in Accra. And what this is all about, and I quote from Ismay's book, it's about the wider range of actors and texts discernible and in the scattered archive of non-state organizations, which facilitate a move away from singular thinkers and their heroics, and towards a social history of anti-colonial thought, towards the collective labor of 20th century transnational activism and its many paper objects. The daily lives, mobilities, printed work, publicity strategies all make the anti-colonial culture of this generation that you say in the book, and I quote, was chronologically bounded and whose constituent elements were fleeting and unstable. And I kept thinking, and I have some ideas after reading the book, but perhaps we can discuss that. What was so characteristic of this cohort's anti-colonial culture that we cannot find in previous generations, like for instance, the transnational activism of Moroccan and nationalists in the decade between 46 and 56 that David Stenner follows, for instance, in Globalizing Morocco, or the Lusophone Africans in the 60s and early 70s, right? And these two other generations, the Moroccans, for instance, and the Luso-Africans, shared with your East Central African cohort similar origins as students and activists. The awakening of nationalist awareness also happened somehow in educational settings, or at least partly. They as well invested heavily in dissemination of their claims through paper objects and created networks of correspondence overseas. They as well had to navigate sooner or later a world defined by Cold War rivalries, conspiracies, suspicions, and had to adapt their strategies of publicity and mobility to this rapidly changing environment. There are many aspects in the book that resonate with the research agenda that Steffi and I pursue in the context of the XFB, and Steffi already mentioned that, which demonstrates that our project of a database on anti-colonial and socialist mobilities not only makes sense for our two projects, but will benefit greatly from your contribution, Ismay, and from a broader collaborative effort spanning different chronologies and geographies. In the book, one can see how blurred are the contours between identity categories and how these shape the mobilities of your actors. They move around while being activist students, youth, exile, publicity secretaries, and we can observe how their profiles become richer and richer in this decade that you reconstruct. This is an advantage, but also liability. And you hinted at this complex relationship between identities, identification categories, and mobility patterns. And this is certainly an issue that deserves further investigation. And I think we can all benefit from a collective effort of thinking and pulling our research outcomes together. The mobilities and activities of the main actors in your book need to be understood within the overlapping of multiple spatialities and spatial imaginaries that characterize the mid and the second half of the 20th century. On the one hand, your book clearly shows that the activism of this generation went far beyond national claims for independence and engaged very actively in the production of regional imaginaries and discourses. On the other hand, the transnational linkages and networks of these actors on multiple scales delineate their own spatiality, at times overlapping with that of the colonial project, but also countering it through a series of alternatives with new reference points on third worldism, Pan-Africanism, and Afro-Asian contexts. A central aspect of the book is the making of a generation, how you call it, right? Of anti-colonial activists from East and Central Africa, and I found a lot of parallels with similar generations in other contexts. Like, for instance, the generation of Cabral, or the Geração da Utopia, the generation of utopia, concepts that were used to describe the group of Luso-African activists that formed the first nationalist movements, such as the PAIGS in Guinea-Bissau or the MPLA in Angola, right? And I was wondering if their generational behavior as older militants, somehow as gatekeepers that control the mobility of the younger ones, of the ones that came after them, this gatekeeping behavior was, and their generational behavior was something acquired and learned from similar cohorts in other contexts. And I was thinking, for instance, on did they learn how to manage intergenerational relations and behavior, for instance, from the West Africans that came before them and that had already fought their battles? The generation at the center of your book is clearly a male generation, with only a few female voices from the region, but where women appear more prominently is in the British context. I found examples of the female secretaries of the UDC and other organizations fascinating, and I love the picture, great, in page 146, that says so much about the relations and joint work at that time. The example of Audrey Jupe, that's in the middle of the photo, and its relation with Banda or with humor is not an isolated example. Joan Wicken worked and had also close relations with Nyerere until his death. Marga Holmes did the same with Agostinho Neto, right? Pre-independence in Dar es Salaam and after independence in Luanda in the 60s. And I believe your work can serve as an entry point for further research on the anonymous work of these women that acted as crucial mediators between African activists and leaders post-independence and Western audiences, as I said, both in the period pre-independence and post-independence. In chapter 4, recounting the fruitless trip of Hume to Iceland, you make clear that, and I quote, the ambivalence towards human rights regimes that characterize this cohort's anti-colonial culture. And I found it striking, and that you quote, the language of human rights had limited traction for this cohort. These actors had come to notice the blurry distinctions between humanitarianism and human rights, individual and collective rights, innate and civil rights, and did not try to exploit this ambivalence. Why? Why did the rights discourse did not mobilize more? Was it monopolized from the by the colonial state? And they didn't see any space to make the claims on this basis? Because I couldn't avoid the comparison with the Luso-African case that I know more in the second half of the 60s and late 60s, when colonial Portugal invested heavily in instrumentalizing human rights discourses to defend itself in the UN and other fora. But the liberation movements responded also appropriating parts of this discourse on human rights and humanitarian law, for instance. And your actors were very moderate in this whole perspective, right? They didn't start liberation struggles as did the Luso-Africans. So it will fit to them this idea of championing the human rights cause as a claim-making device. And finally, sorry, I come to an end. The printed war was a central point aspect of the anti-colonial activism of this generation. It looks like they didn't give much importance to visualizations, to photographs or drawings, I don't know, that were so prominent in later cohorts, like for instance the Luso-Africans, right? Another geography, sorry. Is this probably a difference with other anti-colonial cultures? Can we say that with previous and with later anti-colonial cultures that they didn't use drawings, visualizations? And yeah, I wouldn't go any further because I think I already raised a lot of points, and I will keep going on. And I don't want to spoil, so I leave it here. And I invite you all to read a fascinating book.
Thanks a lot, Anna. I don't know how many aspects are still left open. John, I'm looking forward to your comment.
Yes, so Ismay, thank you for the invitation to be here today. I am very intrigued by your work and how you have worked with very messy archives and I would say very messy stories and histories into the incoherence that you talk about into a coherent book. So congratulations on that. And absolutely, so you talk about, you mentioned the political thought of prominent activists and their daily lived experiences of transnational activism. And your book brings out some very intriguing issues that coming from Kenya, where most of the struggle was geared towards mostly the national. I'm talking about intellectuals like, some of the first would be then Jomo Kenyatta, who is very much, in a sense, a nationalist. And yet, in your book, you managed to bring out the fact that that some of these transnational activists, their actions did not put the nation or the party as being central, but you insist. You show that that in any case they had transregional, if you could call that, or regional imaginaries in their work. And I'm very fascinated by how the book brings out, the little minute details of how they are preparing their pamphlets and imagining their publics, and so choosing what to use and when to use it. And so to just connect to that would be a question of language, because your work, a quote from you say mostly in English. And I would wonder whether other languages would then play a role. Yes, so the idea of regional imaginaries being more important than national imaginaries. Of course, when I looked at the map in the book, and right now, I was in Kenya last week, so I wish there was more Kenya in this book. And yes, of course, because at the University of Leipzig, we had for 15 years the lack of, at the Institute of African Studies, being blessed by the presence of Abdelatif Abdallah, who was one of the, you would say then post-independence or around independence, Kenyan independence, somebody who would then have been also put in prison, who was, one of the anti-colonial activists who really shaped the anti-colonial culture of African activists in East Africa, but also, transnationally. It would be in London and other places. But I commend you also on going beyond the borders of what you have shown us and connecting absolutely to other East African archives like Murumbi's, that I'm very familiar and whose contribution is at the Kenya National Archives and so on and so forth, right? So, as I was reading these, I was trying, of course, to connect to the daily activities that Abdelatif Abdallah, Kenyan activists, would have then described about one of the, you call them, one of the hubs of anti-colonial activity. And I was wondering whether you have a sense of the security of these activists, because, well, in some of these anti-colonial, hubs, and specifically to mention London, there is a suggestion that the British intelligence was offering some assistance to some of the activists, and actually informing them whenever there was plans somehow to either attack them in these hubs and so on. So just wondering about the London intelligence operators, if is of any help to those who are there. And I'll just read a section that was really fascinating, which would be on page 7, where you say that, and I quote, "Anti-colonialism was not always nationalist. Nationalism was not always anti-colonial. Anti-colonial nationalism was not always the modus operandi of liberation struggles in post-war Africa." So you say that this is a historiographical starting point, and of course, rather than the argument of this book. And also, I just want to read a section very briefly, where you say on page 8 that when we follow them abroad, contestations over the nation and party, so crucial both to foundational and revisionist histories of nationalism, appear less central. So equally, thinking through an anti-colonial culture takes emphasis away from the legal territorial goal that actors had in mind and places it on the social and intellectual processes that accompanied the pursuit of this goal. I have to tell you, I was going to bring a poster, and then we had a snowstorm, kind of. I was going to bring a poster of their contemporary from Kenya, and just, put it somewhere here so that it really enjoys the aura of what you have written so very well. And I look forward to further discussions on your book, and I have more questions than I note here. But of course, we have an audience who wants to comment. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Don. I think that also shows how much there is also a bridge towards the present that the book also is building. But Marius, please, last but not least.
Yeah, thank you so much. Ismay, before I go into the well-deserved praise singing, I really want to thank you for taking us along on this wonderful intellectual journey, across Africa, across East and Central Africa, taking us on a detour to South Asia, Western Europe, and last but certainly not least, North Africa, where I'm sure some of your research will continue. The period you studied for the whole African continent, not just the regions you investigate, I mean, this was a period of great hope, many disappointments, global connections, regional variations, and as your study clearly indicates, local contradictions. The physical and social mobilities of African anti-colonial activists you study here in great detail are a testament to the proverbial jockeying for positions during this period of economic, social, and political transition, which scholars like Robert Tino, Fred Cooper, Sarah Stockwell, just to mention some of my favorites, have tackled from a very different top-down approach. This was the most important thing that I noticed when, in the first 2 chapters. Unlike these books coming from these extremely well-recognized authors, your book is not a self-fulfilling prophecy of anti-colonial political mobilization, but a multifaceted, bottom-up struggle for recognition, legitimacy, and most importantly, as your book argues, a political voice. The point of departure in your book is not a post-war crisis in the metropole, but an African student movement questioning the colonial logic of a highly contested regional federation that would create a new colonial polity out of an administrative patchwork of protectorates, colonies, and settler colonies. For me personally, this is the most important and novel contribution that lets your book stand out in this very competitive historical genre. Reading your book and exploring the footnotes, I learned that very different anti-colonial strategies were adopted in protectorates, colonies, and settler colonies. This really extends our knowledge of the late colonial state in Africa, and most importantly, how young Africans navigated global anti-colonial politics from very different vantage points. This book is extremely well written and researched. I think, but I dare say, not a very easy read. I have to tell you, Ismay, I challenged myself to reading the first 3 chapters very quickly, and I failed miserably. The problem is not in the quality of your writing, and the problem is with my, I hope not with the quality of my reading, but my enthusiasm, and I plowed through all those, footnotes, and I learned so much that I'm taking along for my own research. And I think my message is here, the book is very accessible, but only if one is prepared to plow through those footnotes, which we here, of course, love doing. I warn you, the first 3 chapters are demanding. So the subjects and main protagonists in this book are a diverse group of African students. By diverse, I mean, I refer to their socioeconomic backgrounds. All of these students were biological males and did eventually ascend to positions of relative privilege that created multiple opportunities for social and physical mobilities. Higher education acts as the ideological catalyst to an anti-colonial public and international community here. More importantly, as you write, they could only go where a scholarship sent them. Yes, this is a very important aspect of the logistics of the journeys that many of these people undertook. So whether they ended up in Britain, India, or elsewhere, defined the anti-colonial work that was possible. I quote you from page 73. Physical mobility, be it to East Africa, Asia, West Africa, and Britain, was extremely challenging in those times. And reading I think it was the 3rd chapter, I felt that there is incredible ease with which the protagonists of this book move between Central Africa, Southeast Asia. And from my own personal knowledge of a historiography on Central Africa, such as Nyasaland, mobility, physical and social mobility was incredibly difficult, even within Central and East Africa, yet alone going to Asia or of a colonial metropole. On top of that, the bureaucratic challenges, I thought, could show us so much about late colonial administration. We know, I remember reading in one chapter and then in, I think, 2 footnotes, a situation about visas. Visas were very challenging. They continue to be extremely challenging for African students today, as you know, I know from my administrative work. So I think it would be very interesting to having a look at the logistics, the finance of these journeys. I know at one stage you talk about a preference, one scholar's preference over a land journey to London, and that being too expensive to finance, or too problematic, I believe, within the visa framework. So it would be interesting to think about some aspects of finance and logistics. One aspect that I personally did not follow was that where, when, and how anti-colonial indoctrination of these students took place. All of these students were born in colonial Africa and knew nothing else but colonial Africa. So I'm a novice in this historical genre. I'm looking for an entry point into these students' anti-colonial culture. Where did the critical understanding and pragmatism stem from? I think many of these journeys, I know in the case of Southern African historiographies on youth activists, already started in high schools. I mean, in your book, you also write that high school teachers were graduates and even participants in these movements. So a lot of these students were indoctrinated in their high schools, in their A-level colleges, or whatever they were taking at the time, and they came to universities with certain expectations, but also with preconceived notions of what agendas these student movements would pursue. And I think Anna already talked about this intergenerational approach. Yes, that would be interesting to see how some of these students, later scholars, inherited particular anti-colonial cultures or really developed their own. I think that's something that I would really be interested to read about in your future work. But yeah, most importantly, and I finish off here, this is just to touch upon a point on John went into. Yes, we're dealing here with a classical linguistic division between Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone Africa. Does Anglophone Africa provide a unique perspective on not only a colonial state, but an institutionalized, via higher education, anti-colonial approach? And I think your book doesn't maintain that there's something particularly unique about the British colonial state. But I think how students developed their understanding of the anti-colonial struggle looking beyond an Anglophone world. I know you touched that on the topic, referring to a couple of, even I believe, misunderstandings with one Francophone delegate. But I really think that, focusing on these relationships that went across not only regions, but more importantly, linguistic lines, would really show a particular aspect of this anti-colonial culture in Central and East Africa. And this is where I end off.
Thanks a lot, Marius. Ismay, I think it will be impossible to address all the questions, ranging from the also comparative and connective perspectives of Anna's comments across generations and spaces, the hints of John on messy archives and messy histories, none the least the hints to footnotes, which I really appreciate here, but also the questions of challenges to mobilities and obstacles to mobility. There's a whole universe. So pick and choose, and then we can invite the audience to continue.
Yeah, thank you, all three of you, for these really insightful comments that have also helped me think in new ways, and and helped put the book in in the context of also other relevant work. I appreciate that. Maybe three kind of responses that bring out some of the themes from across your comments. The first one is this idea of the relationship of this, what I call an anti-colonial culture, that I locate within this generational regional cohort, and its relationship to things before, after, and elsewhere. This fact that you brought up, Mariusz, of that, where did this indoctrination happen? Which I think I would push back against this that idea, in that it was also then. I guess that was the perspective also of the colonial state, that would assume that any critique of colonialism must come from having read some subversive literature elsewhere, rather than from simply living as a person in a colonized state. So that question then is one I grappled with a lot. What was what inspired these particular activists also to then dedicate a lot of energy and resources and their time to these questions, when of course we know that a lot of other people did not live such mobile and politically involved lives. Anna suggested that there would be links to West African students and activists before, and in fact, I'm reluctant to come to that conclusion, and that's precisely why I choose to start the book in chapter 1. Truly happen in this region. The whole of chapter 1 happens in this region, to, I hope, show that there are that the origins of a lot of their activism and thought can be found here at Makerere, in high schools, like you mentioned, and in the regional debates that are happening there. And that's, I guess, a methodological point, in that kind of region as method and region as subject kind of entangle in certain ways. And this perhaps this also links perhaps to the radical or moderate question, and their engagement with topics like human rights. And that's also something that I grappled with a lot, trying to locate these activists in a version of a moderate, radical worldview that I guess we have often understood through literature on the Cold War, and trying to think through these categories of radical. And I do that especially in chapter 4, as you mentioned. And I also was surprised by the difficulty in locating them within this framework, and perhaps that has pushed me, and hopefully will push further research as well, to think outside of this moderate radical divisions. And yet we do still sometimes need these descriptors to try and understand the political activities of people in the past, and in their own contexts. The second point then I wanted to bring up was about language and region. I mean, linking in a way to this idea of how activists from this region related to also Francophone and Lusophone activists, but also how they navigated the linguistic environment, the multilingual environment that they grew up in. I think that's another thing that was surprising over the course of doing the research, was that I was really looking for especially links with Francophone activists on the borders of this region. And of course, if you're looking at other topics, there are these links, and our colleague Geert would I'm sure, tell us more about these links that also then don't necessarily rely on the colonial languages, Anglophone, Francophone, but also links across borders, of course, using other African languages. Most of the material that these activists produced, or at least that I was able to get to consult, was in English, and that is indeed it's always hard to know if how far one's own linguistic limits define what you're able to find in a way. Because I mean, I did also use material in Swahili and was looking for material in Swahili and in French. And it's perhaps because I had this quite surprising East and Central African conglomeration that Swahili ended up not being a useful language for them to work across this region. Whereas if I'd been thinking of Kenya and Tanganyika and activists working across that area, and indeed Mozambique, then perhaps Swahili would have come out more. And this question of Swahili as a regional language is also something that there's lots of interesting scholarship on, and that we've also been thinking about in the more recent project that Steffi mentioned, led by Emma Hunter. And in that sense, I then would perhaps just mention a third thing about this question of challenges to mobility, security in cities like London, the difficulties of the practical difficulties of moving around, and the women secretaries, which I think all comes together very nicely as something that's really important in the book. And I hope, or I've really intended to kind of de-romanticize this life of transnational activism and of easy mobility. And you're completely right that mobility for this generation, and especially for this regional cohort, was by no means easy. All the challenges that you mentioned, and they come out, I think, in the stories of especially Mayanja and Sipalo, and their travels for higher education in chapter 2. The question of the security services, then, in fact, the going over land was there was resistance on the part of colonial authorities to students traveling over land or via ship, but precisely because it was imagined to be a space where of especially communist influences and other radical, also anti-colonial influences. So there was a move to pay for plane tickets, despite it being more expensive. So it kind of already gives an impression of the priorities of the funders of these sorts of journeys, which were often either states, the colonial state, or newly independent states like India and Egypt, that both come up a little bit. And then also various kind of non-governmental funds, Cold War Youth and Student Internationals, these sorts of funders. And once students were in these metropoles, whether the colonial metropole or cities elsewhere, there was indeed a lot of security issues. In fact, Dennis von Beyer, in the center of this photo, Jim Brennan has done some research on von Beyer that has shown that he was simultaneously working for MI6 and also for the Czech security services later in his life, and led a really fascinating life as a triple agent. And so, there's some really interesting work going on about these questions, and indeed this relates often to the typically white women secretaries who were involved in the administrative labor of this sort of activism. Just maybe a final comment about something that I think is particularly important about the book that came out of the passages that John quoted about this, about its relationship to scholarship on nationalism, and there's Mariusz also mentioned Frederick Cooper's work, and there's been, I guess, we could mention also Edom Getachu's recent work about the kind of non-inevitability of the nation state as the final, as the outcome of decolonization, and about the different forms that the different spatial and organizational forms that anti-colonialism could take. And in the end, this was a debate that was very prominent whilst I was doing my research. And in the end, the relationship of my book to this question is precisely what John mentioned, that I'm interested less in what they were pursuing, but in what it involved to pursue that goal. So that's perhaps also, my relationship to intellectual history and its various approaches in that sense has changed a little, in that I was initially very interested in political thought and in trying to kind of locate these thinkers as intellectuals and thinkers in this question of how were people imagining the post-colonial world to be. And what I found was that perhaps more interesting was this maybe more mundane issue of what were they doing, and what ideas did they have about effective activism, which is also, in the end, these are also worldviews of, as John said, imagining publics and kind of doing this work to overcome the difficulties of mobility and of moving also paper across borders, which was often not much easier than moving people across borders, if it was. So perhaps that's I hope a response to some of the things that have arisen.
I think there's still opportunity to delve into those details, but I think that the audience might also want to join or raise questions, ask for which chapter to read first, which footnote to check. So the floor is open. And for those on Zoom, it would be great if you might turn your camera on, if that's possible, so that we can also see you. But of course, that's a decision up to you.
Just want to be sure what Mariusz meant. What did you mean by indoctrinated? I just want to be sure what you, where you were.
You know, I believe, well, I'm sure that all of these students were, they came out of a particular colonial education system. The universities that Ismay discusses, particularly Makerere, at the beginning was still a satellite university of London University College. And what I find unique is with these students coming from, well, at that time still wasn't called an O-level system, going into higher education, that I believe that, they had to actively challenge the intellectual tradition they were brought up in. So my question is, where did this intellectual challenge and pragmatism with this challenge develop? I know from my own reading that teachers, high school teachers, were extremely important. They saw themselves as particular anti-colonial intermediaries, even in the educational system. They said, okay, this is what we have in our textbooks here, but I want you guys to think like this. So this is what I'm referring to, you know, where these students develop these anti-colonial thoughts rather than actions, because let's be sure, I mean, the book begins with anti-colonial actions, but the thoughts preceded those actions. Is that?
Yeah, I think this it relates to perhaps also the methodological route that I ended up thinking through, which was rather than kind of tracing an idea as it passed through kind of great minds, but instead to kind of see the ideas that were that presupposed all of the actions that happened. So I guess perhaps there's been, I think, rightful criticism of intellectual histories of anti-colonialism that locate the sort of the idea of anti-colonialism, for example, in Marx or even in Hegel, or rather than locating it in this case, these students who started a student strike related to ostensibly food conditions in the student cafeteria, and yet in fact they were dealing with a whole system that I guess in that sense my argument would be that their ideas and their critique of the colonial state and the colonial global system came out of their day-to-day practices of wanting to find space for their voices and their ambitions in a world that didn't allow for that. But maybe John, do you have something to add?
At the danger of embarrassing myself in front of my former teacher, Professor Johns, because I'm probably too close to this topic, I'm just wondering whether some of these then, sons and daughters, and mostly sons, are growing up in families, are actually seeing and living in a colonial state, and they talk to their families, they see what is going on, and even before then they move somewhere where they get then formal education. And I'm trying to imagine my own family in Kenya, some of them who were incarcerated in concentration camps, like my grandfather, whose direct name I take, John Jenga Karugia, was incarcerated in Limuru, amongst the Mamau and so on. So I'm too close to this topic, maybe to Professor Johns would say. But yeah, just wondering that whether that it also comes from, the agency of their families and the memories and so on and so forth, that they are actually talking and living already somewhere in families, that you do not really need to formalize it into something. I'm trying to keep it simple here. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree, and I guess these that is quite hard to find in archival sources, and that's precisely perhaps where oral histories become important. And of course, that's not to say
because
that
you did some interviews as well.
I did some interviews, although perhaps I guess I could talk about them. They don't form a huge part of the kind of the narrative or the argument or the structure of the book, but they were hugely formative for my thinking. But I would completely agree. And at the same time, these students are also reading things. For example, they're reading literature by Caribbean and African American authors written in the interwar period. They're reading George Padmore, and for example,
absolutely.
And then they're looking in the situation which I focus on at Makerere in the early 50s. They are looking precisely to Kenya and to the Mau Mau activists, which indeed came out of, not out of a kind of a highly educated intellectual current, but out of, like you say, this more grassroots activism. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting dynamic to think
like
through.
you say in your book, the issue of land and race and settler conflicts, which you mentioned, I think, for Kenya and Zimbabwe and one other country that I'm missing. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. No, precisely, and maybe that's also an opportunity then to say that that was very important to this regional formation. I perhaps didn't mention that already. The region that we saw on the map had at its borders Kenya and Zimbabwe, which were settler states, and that this regional imaginary that we're thinking about was important for that these places at the edges were important for defining the region that precisely didn't include Kenya, because they were aware of this greater obstacle and challenge that came with settler colonialism. But that's, I mean, this region was also very fluid, and at different times and in different forums, it looked very different.
The third one was Zanzibar.
Yeah, exactly, Zanzibar.
I have already one question from the audience. Megan, you need to use that. In the meantime, I try to read the chat.
Thanks so much, Ismay, and thanks also to all of the commentators for giving us some insight into this book, which seems really impressive. And one thing I was thinking about in a parallel to this discussion on, you know, your efforts and contribution to moving beyond these ideas of political ideologies that move beyond the nation state or nationalism in decolonization, and rather to think about this in terms of practice, the transnational practice, the regional one, etc. We at the Research Center Global Dynamics also design a lot of research projects that are based on actors that orient themselves, you know, trans-regionally, regionally, etc. But this creates also your own difficulties as then a historian to undertake the research. So I was really wondering, from a practical level, you know, what kind of archival research you did and undertook, and how this went. You mentioned just briefly now interviews, so I was also wondering about that, if you had any interviews that you undertook, and maybe you could tell us a little about your own map, not just the map that your actors produced, but maybe the one that you also produced in your own archival journey. So thanks a lot. Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a nice opportunity to be able to talk about that, and it's safe to say that the subjects, the protagonists of my book were better traveled and better read than I am, so in that sense. But I did, so archives in the 4 countries, perhaps I'll share again my screen. Archives in these 4 countries were very important to my overall source base, as were archives in Kenya. John mentioned the personal archive of Joseph Marumbi, which is really an incredible source, being a personal archive of a kind of quite prolific collector and administrator and correspondent, as well as being a Pan-African intellectual and political organizer, and later a very important political figure as well. But perhaps the place to start with my archives, and the thing that fascinated me most about the material, and that was really at the root of the topic, is this idea of organizations and the organizational archives that come out of quite informal and non-state-based groups. This organization that I mentioned at the beginning, the Committee of African Organizations, their premises was attacked, was suffered an arson attack, and
almost no archival records survive, but it was also a very ad hoc sort of an operation, and it came to clearer that that was typical of a lot of the groups that I was interested in. And yet at the same time, there was an interest on the part of lobbying groups and kind of youth internationals, these sorts of groups, pamphleteering groups, pressure groups. They had an interest in documenting their own organizational history. So these, organizational archives were really at the heart of the project. And they were located mainly in Europe. Then to kind of, in a way, temper the narratives that come out of these quite self-fashioned archives, I used state archives in East and Central Africa, as well as colonial archives in the UK. But was really, in the end, fascinated by this kind of ephemera and paperwork, correspondence, notes, invitations, flyers for meetings, this sort of material, which really shaped my whole research agenda and the questions that I was asking. And I was then kind of determined for my next project to really start with archives in the place that I was interested in, because I guess there is a global histories do kind of valorize this multi-archival research, but what's not visible in a bibliography is the order in which you went to these archives, and that's hugely that really makes a difference to the sorts of research questions that that come out of your archival work, and yeah, so that was a really interesting process. The interviews and oral histories that I conducted were not really part of the original project design, but whilst I spent time in East and Central Africa for archival work, these opportunities arose to talk to people, and in that sense, I went into these interviews, or informal, like semi-structured interviews, without a huge amount of preconceptions of what I hoped to get out of them, and there were a few things that they really shaped my thinking on. One of them was gender. I interviewed there are just 10 interviews listed in the bibliography. 3 of them were women, and the women that I talked to were all married at some point to activists, but I was determined to interview them as activists and political thinkers in their own right. But their narratives of how their lives related to kind of global historical change were characterized by a different sort of story, which was always being caught up in things happening to you and being caught up in a certain political moment. And my conclusion from that was not necessarily about gender, but just simply helping me see the different ways that people relate to their own lives and the lives' relationships to something as significant as the decolonization of several countries in the region. There was something else I wanted to mention about the interviews. They're also very...
You talked about women.
Yeah.
Questions.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah. In any case, I think the 2 were very important, but and perhaps that these interviews also helped me get out of this organizational framework, which, if you read the book, and perhaps part of what is challenging is that it's full of acronyms. This kind of Cold War, post-war moment is just everyone always setting up committees with new acronyms. And yet, when you talk to people about these organizations that they worked with, perhaps not even for very long, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, that like these kind of acronyms all fall apart, and the kind of organizedness that you see from an organizational archive you can see as an illusion. So in that sense, the interviews will really change my perspective. Yeah.
Ismay, could you unshare your screen, because then I can read the chat?
Yeah,
because we have a longer comments in the chat going on. Nathan is commenting extensively, and I think that's maybe also more as a contextual comment to you. So I see this right, commenting on the different contexts of activists, how they were politicized, which role Muslims from Tanganyika played, which role soldiers in the First World War played, and also connections between the Anglophone and Francophone community. Since you can read the chat yourself, I dare, Nathan, I hope you do not mind, not to read this all out. I see a hand up. I think I recognized, yes, Seung. There was the railroad picture. I remember so from earlier times. Hi, Seung. You have a question.
Yes. Hi, Steffi, and congratulations for Ismay for a great book. I'm really looking forward to reading yours very soon. So my question has to go based on what I have heard so far from your talk and the discussion. My first question is regarding the year that you set up in your title, like between 52 and 66. And I was really wondering about the end point, the 66, and how is your story related to the post-colonial student activism in East Africa, and especially maybe in Dar es Salaam in 68, like how would you connect this anti-colonial activism with this, I would say, post-colonial student activism in 68? Is the first question. Second question is global nature of your stories. So as you showed Dennis von Beer as a part of your picture, I remember I once read that Dennis von Beer has been to China and North Korea in 1959. So that's the period near your research. I was wondering whether this anti-colonial activists in East Africa had any kind of lessons from, I would say, post-colonial development in East or Southeast Asia, or those areas which experienced anti-colonialism or independence slightly preceding East Africa in late 1950s or early 1960s. So how would the stories of different parts of the world could resonate with these the activism in this region is my second question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for both those questions. Thank you, Nathan, for these points about the kind of the various inspirations and origins of different ideas, and they're all very much important, and I allude to some of them in the book. I should mention that Nathan's father is pictured. I'm no longer showing the screen. In the photo that we saw, Kanyama Chiumi. So it's really wonderful that you're here, Nathan. Thank you, Seung, as well for these questions. I think both really important ones. Firstly, about the endpoint of 66 and the importance of late 60s kind of global student activism. There's been some really fantastic work on kind of global 68 and African 68s. And George Roberts, who I think was here, but is maybe not, has got a fantastic book if you're interested in 68 in the context of Dar es Salaam and what students were doing there. As I frame it in my book, this is a sort of a different generation that by the time 68 comes around, these activists are no longer students and no longer really young. And one of the interesting things that came out was their, I think maybe we mentioned this in the comments as well, their attempts to kind of gatekeep this activism world, and that younger students in the generation below became something like a liability to a kind of the image of that needed to be maintained as they reached independence. And as we said, lots of these activists then took on quite prominent roles in new governments. So that's, yeah, the relationship between this earlier generation and the kind of the 68 generation is a really interesting one to explore. And perhaps also relates to your question about the links with East and Southeast Asia. There's also some really good work going on about relating to this. On the North Korea question, Tycho van der Hoog at Leiden is doing some really interesting research on relationships with North Korean cultural policy. On China, there's some interesting work on the kind of diplomatic relations, kind of more post-independence, that Jodie Sun has done. Her book's also recently just come out. And I think for my response in terms of this generation and their activities in the 1950s, thinking especially of Southeast Asia and the Bandung Conference in 55, is that there was some skepticism towards Bandung, and also a recognition of its inaccessibility for activists of this generation from this region, who were not in the end present, and neither were neither were other representatives from these countries, because Bandung was for independent states. So there's then something interesting about the chronology and the of the decolonization period, and this sense that Southeast Asia was gaining, countries in Southeast Asia were gaining independence at an earlier moment. So that perhaps explains why Southeast and East Asian countries do not figure on this map of journeys that I presented. But these kind of everything that was happening around Bandung, and which there's work from the Afro-Asian Networks Research Collective that pulls all these kind of strands together, was influential and important. But I think that what comes out of my book is that they treated these kind of precursors with some amount of hesitation.
Thanks, Ismay. I think there's a lot of food for thought that we also can further chew on, if I'm not completely mistaken. in the context of the reception, thank you, Sion, for this question. His work is hopefully putting North Korea on this map in the very future. I learned that at the end of your 30s, you're already old to be a radical activist. Well, that might be true. We can discuss this over a glass of wine. Thanks a lot for the commentators. Thanks a lot, Ismay, for sharing your insights with us. Thanks a lot to the audience and to the people on Zoom who have to have their own glass of wine separately.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who joined. It's really nice to see you all. And thank you to all the audience who are here. And please do join for a drink, I hope.
And congratulations to you.
Thank you.